Before we get to the security-centric part of this discussion, we're going to do a quick review of the VLAN fundamentals. Going to look at a couple of commands that really come into handy when you're working with VLANs. Hey! You, the one that's about to fast forward through the VLAN stuff, stop it. I know that you may have seen this material recently, but you may not have. It may have been years since you got your CCNA. And while I know you know the fundamentals of virtual LANs, we're going to go over them, take a couple of minutes, go over them anyway. And let's go ahead and run a couple of commands because everything that we do in this review has something to do with our very first security discussion. We don't want to talk about securing VLANs if we're a little fuzzy on the fundamentals. So let's go quickly over this. We know that if all hosts are connected to a switch are seen by that switch as all being in the same local area network, we're going to end up with a lot of unnecessary broadcasts because we know what a switch does with a broadcast. It's going to forward it out every port except the one it came in on. Also, if there's an unknown unicast address, it really has the same behavior. So we end up with a lot of unnecessary traffic. And of course, everything we do in networking has a cost in time, cost in processor power, and it just starts adding up. Now, when we put the hosts into their own virtual LANs, we've really reduced the number of those broadcasts and the scope of those broadcasts while making the overall switching process a lot more effective. Two commands that we use to get a lot of fundamental VLAN information are show VLAN, which gives you a lot of information. Let me make that screen just a tad bigger there. This command does give way too much information because it's going to give you the VLAN numbers and everything, and there's a lot of extra info down here as far as bridge mode, STP, etc. And if you have any remote span VLANs, it's going to tell you the primary and the secondary type, etc. As far as other types of VLANs go. But generally going to need. So I like to run show VLAN brief. And if I told you that this was a 12-port switch, what do you think those other 3 ports are doing right now? If you don't see them here in show VLAN brief, where should you look for them? You should probably look for them with show interface trunk because they are going to be trunking most likely. And with these 3 trunks that I've got running between my 2 switches, I didn't have to do anything beyond cable them correctly. I didn't have to go to the ports because the ports by default are actively attempting to trunk. This is an issue as well. So there are your 2 basic commands, and we know that if you put a switch port into an access port, that puts the port into one and only VLAN, one and only one VLAN, where a trunk port is a member by default of all VLANs. And as I mentioned, switch ports are always attempting to trunk unless we configure them to do otherwise, and that actually is a security issue. So let's go one more time with show interface trunk again. We got that. You see the native VLAN information. We're going to talk about that as well. That's what by default the mode that our Cisco switch ports are in. So they are actively attempting to trunk. So when you take a crossover cable, you connect the 2 switches, you're going to get a trunk in just a few seconds. So that is a security problem. Well, it's more the trouble with attempting to trunk. Because that default of dynamic desirable, what it means, the port is attempting to trunk by sending DTP frames, the dynamic trunking protocol. Whether or not this actually does happen and has happened is that the switch on the other end of that attempted trunk may not be under our administrative control. Now, we do have other defenses against that later in this part of the course. But in many networks today, you're going to find DTP turned off. And all you have to do is go to the interface level and use the switchport no negotiate command. Actually, we'll take a quick look at that. And you'll see this one right here. It's on a non-trunking. I just wanted to illustrate to you what the command was. It's switchport no negotiate. Device will not engage in negotiation protocol on this interface. So there we're talking about DTP. Also note, something that might have caught your eye is that I have this other VLAN, VLAN 22, and it's active and I don't have any ports. in that particular VLAN. There's nothing wrong with that, obviously. You know, the switch let me create it. But this is actually part of a security plan, and I'll tell you about that in just a minute, because you may well see it in a lot of production networks that you work with. Now, what's going on with that tagging? Well, we know what happens with tagging with .1q. You know, once a trunk is created via IEEE 802.1q, which thankfully is just called .1q most of the time, frames that go across that trunk are tagged. And there is one major exception, but that tag identifies the destination VLAN. You know, nothing wrong with that. That's exactly how we want it to work. Now, that one major exception I just mentioned is the native VLAN. And again, let's just bring that up one more time. Really important that you know where to spot this, and it's in Show Interface Trunk. It's going to show your native VLAN here, which is VLAN 1 by default. Now, if a frame is destined for the native VLAN, that transmitting switch is not going to tag the frame. So then, instead of just a little bit of overhead, there's no additional overhead because of the tagging, because there isn't any. When that switch on the other end of the trunk gets a frame and there's no tag on it, the receiving switch says, okay, I know. Now, the native VLAN is VLAN 1 by default, and this can be changed, and often it should be, because this is another potential security issue. Isn't it amazing things that can be used against us? You know, you think ARP couldn't possibly be used as a weapon. Dynamic ARP inspection. In another part of the course, you see that it is, or that it can be, but here's where the problem comes in, and it's actually called VLAN Hopping. And it doesn't sound very threatening, right? I mean, it sounds like something that would almost be desirable. Hey, VLAN hopping. But there is a security issue. It's called double tagging. And it's named that way because the intruder is going to transmit frames that are indeed double tagged with two separate VLAN IDs. Now, we have to be aware of this threat, but as you're going to see in a moment, it's the easiest to carry out, because certain circumstances have to be present in order for it to work for the attacker. You know, so you do see these and you think, you know, is this really worth the trouble? Well, let's look at the prerequisites for someone to be able to use double tagging against us. First off, the intruder's host device has to be attached to an access port. Okay. The third one, .1q, must be the trunking protocol in use, because we remember the other major trunking protocol, ISL, does not even use the native VLAN. Okay, that's not too hard for an attacker because .1q is a very popular protocol. In the middle, though, the VLAN used by that access has to be the native VLAN. So there's a lot going on here for an attacker to be able to use double tagging against us. Now, again, it doesn't when we've got so many other more serious attacks to worry about, right? But VLAN hopping has been used for network attack to swiping bank account information. It's beyond the scope of the exam, but certainly if you want to go to Wikipedia or just go to Google, your favorite search engine, whatever that is, just do a search on VLAN hopping. You'll be surprised how many serious attacks have been launched with what seems like such an innocent little problem. Now, what you'll often see when you go to production networks, and the first time you see this, it'll throw you a little bit. You'll see the native VLAN of a network set to a VLAN that no host on the network is a member of. And you look at that the first time and you're like, well, you know, why are you doing that? Why are you using the native VLAN, which of course cuts down a little bit on on overhead, because we're not putting that tag on the frame. Well, we're doing that kind of as a trade-off, because if we do that, and again, what you're doing is setting the native VLAN to a VLAN that no host on the network is a member of, that stops this particular attack type before it even begins. So that's pretty good stuff. Now, we've got another VLAN hopping variation called switch spoofing. And that doesn't sound too awful either, but this version of hopping actually allows the rogue to pretend to be a member of all VLANs in the network. And this is made possible by, again, the dynamic trunking protocol, DTP. You know, again, something that seems so innocent, DTP, it's like CDP. You know, the first time I heard that a lot of networks turn off Cisco Discovery Protocol, it's like, well, why? You see all those connected devices, everything else. And the problem is it opens a lot of security holes. And as you're seeing here, so does DTP. Now, you could put the switch port into auto mode, but that doesn't really defend against this problem because the attacker's device can pretend to be a switch and send DTP frames of its own. And if that happens, the port in auto mode on the other end says, okay, the other end is initiating negotiation, I'll go ahead and trunk. Well, that's a favorable reaction, but it's favorable to the attacker, and that is definitely not what we want. So, VLAN hopping, let's look at these defenses again. Ports not leading to a switch should be put into access mode. And when you do this, it stops the port's ability to trunk, which stops VLAN hopping right then and there. And that's why so often you'll see a VLAN, like say VLAN 22, and I would put any ports that weren't being actively used into that VLAN. And that stops VLAN hopping right then and there. Now, if a port is trunking, what you can do, and it's recommended, is just to go ahead and put it into unconditional trunking mode with the switchport mode command, and then just cut off those DTP frames. And that's all there is to it. So again, exam-wise for VLAN hopping, I expect you to see something about it. And again, the defenses that we take are not fancy. And I've seen more than one production network where they got put off a little bit. But go ahead and do these things. Any unused ports in your network, put them in a VLAN that no one else is using, and that really stops a lot of the problems right there. You don't even have to worry about VLAN hopping. But we do have some other things we got to worry about as far as some BPDUs going around our network and some other threats. And we're going to pick up with BPDU guard and root guard on the next video. I'll see you there.